Hey, Wings. How are you this evening? I see you, sunshine. Surviving is, it's a low bar, but it's a good bar. Hey, Gam Gam, how are you? Happy Wednesday. Hey, Amy. Welcome in. I actually slept. I went to bed early last night. Hey, Linda. How are you? Hey, Eddie, how we doing? Johnny, welcome in. Hey, Casey. Hey, the gang's all here. Hello, Gil. Bonjour to you. Hey, Mary Jane. Hey, Jojo, how are you? Welcome in. Oh, Casey, which book? Hello, Capricorn Wolf Queen, how are you? I see you, crazy mama. Yeah, Fairy Tale is a newer one. I actually haven't read that one yet. You'll have to let me know how it is. I am doing well. I am doing well. Oh, Johnny, you got a notification? Cool. Awesome. AJ, yes, it does. It does set the mood. Hey, crazy mama, how are you? After you were already here. Well, you came in pretty quick. Jojo, yes it is. We're doing yeah, I can talk. This is going to be a great night. I am doing 2 short stories tonight. Hey, Finnice, how are you? Yeah, it's going to be a really rough night if I can't talk. I think you guys are going to like this. Hello, Cindy. How are you? Words hard. Yes. I not words. Hey, Farah, how are you? Tina, welcome in. Welcome back. Well, we're going to give it another minute here, and we're going to get started. Amy Nick, how are you? Oh, we've got good stories tonight. We've got 2 short stories. Ocean Pearl, thank you. Welcome in. Well, I think it is time to start. So you all liked having the extra day on Monday night? UK in the house. 2 a.m. vibes. Yes, it is. Happy birthday to Crazy Mama. Actually, we got to do this properly. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, Crazy Mama 26. Happy birthday to you. Oh, Kaylee, that's awesome. Thank you. Or should I call you Medusa? These really aren't kids' stories tonight, but I hope you stick around anyway. Yeah. You were just searching for me. Well, I'm glad you're here. Just a minute. I'm actually going to get started. Alrighty then. Hey Lynn, how are you? Alright. Well. You're scared already? These aren't too bad. These 2 are not too bad, but they are fun. They are classics. Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Storytime with UndeadPapa. Tonight, we have 2 haunted houses, 2 old dark places, and the terrible feeling that something unseen is waiting inside. We begin tonight with an ancient abbey, a place long abandoned where the silence itself feels wrong. So wherever you're listening from, dim the lights, sit back, and relax, because story time is about to begin. This is Thurnley Abbey by Percival Landon. I clicked before anybody could say anything. Ha! Take that. Now, this story, just to give you context, this story was first published in 1907. Three years ago, I was on my way out to the east, and as an extra, oh my, see, I told this is going to be a night. I can't talk tonight. Oh boy. All right, we're going to fix that. My brain is messing things up. My apologies, everybody. I'm like 100 people already. I love it. I love it. Well, if you guys share and like the crap out of this, there'll be even more. 3 years ago, I was on my way out to the east, and as an extra day in London was of some importance, I took the Friday evening mail train to Brindisi instead of the usual Thursday morning Marseille express. Many people shrink from the long 48-hour train journey through Europe and the subsequent rush across the Mediterranean in the 19-knot Isis or Osiris, but there is really very little discomfort on either the train or the mailboat. And unless there is actually nothing for me to do, I always like to save the extra day and a half in London before I say goodbye to her for one of my longer tramps. This time it was early. I remember in the shipping season, probably about the beginning of September, there were few passengers. And I had a compartment in the P&O Indian Express to myself all the way from Calais. All Sunday I watched the blue waves dimpling the Adriatic and the pale rosemary along the cuttings, the plain white towns and with their flat roofs and their bold duomos, and the gray-green gnarled olive orchards of Apulia. The journey was just like any other. We ate in the dining car as often and as long as we decently could. We slept after luncheon. We dawdled the afternoon away with yellow-backed novels. Sometimes we exchanged platitudes in the smoking room, and it was there that I met Alistair Colvin. Colvin was a man of medium height, with a resolute, well-cut jaw. His hair was turning gray. His mustache was sun-whitened. Otherwise, he was clean-shaven, obviously a gentleman, and obviously also a preoccupied man. He had no great wit. When spoken to, he made the usual remarks in the right way, and I dare say he refrained from banalities only because he spoke less than the rest of us. Most of the time he buried himself in the Wagon-Lit Company's timetable, but seemed unable to concentrate his attention on any one page of it. He found that I had been over the Siberian Railway, and for a quarter of an hour he discussed it with me. Then he lost interest in it, and rose to go to his compartment. But he came back again very soon, and seemed glad to pick up the conversation again. Of course, this did not seem to me to be of any importance. Most travelers by train become trifle infirm of purpose after 36 hours rattling. But Colvin's restless way I noticed in somewhat marked contrast with the man's personal importance and dignity. Especially ill-suited was it to his finely made large hand with strong, broad, regular nails and its few lines. As I looked at his hand, I noticed a long, deep, and recent scar of a ragged shape. However, it was absurd to pretend that I thought anything was unusual. I went off at 5 o'clock on Sunday afternoon to sleep away the hour or two that had still to be got through before we arrived at Brindisi. Once there, we few passengers transhipped our hand baggage, verified our berths. There were only a score of us in all, and then, after an aimless ramble of half an hour in Brindisi, we returned to dinner at the Hotel International, not wholly surprised that the town had been the death of Virgil. If I remember rightly, there was a gaily painted hall at the International. I do not wish to advertise anything, but there is no other place in Brindisi which to wait the coming of the mails, and after dinner I was looking with awe at a trellis overgrown with blue vines, when Colvin moved across the room to my table. He picked up Il Secolo, but almost immediately gave up the pretense of reading it. He turned squarely to me and said, "Would you do me a favor?" One doesn't do favors to stray acquaintances on continental expresses without knowing something more of them than I knew of Colvin. But I smiled in a noncommittal way and asked him what he wanted. I wasn't wrong in part of my estimate of him. He said bluntly, "Will you let me sleep in your cabin on the Osiris?" And he colored a little as he said it. Now, there is nothing more tiresome than having to put up with a stable companion at sea, and I asked him rather pointedly, Surely there is room for all of us. I thought that perhaps he had been partnered off with some mangy Levantine and wanted to escape from him at all hazards. Colvin, still somewhat confused, said, "Yes, I am in a cabin by myself, but you would do me the greatest favor if you would allow me to share yours." This was all very well, but besides the fact that I always sleep better when alone, there had been some recent thefts on board English liners, and I hesitated. Frank and honest and self-conscious as Colvin was, just then the mail train came in with a clatter and a rush of escaping steam, and I asked him to see me again about it on the boat when we started. He answered me curtly. I suppose he saw the mistrust in my manner. "I am a member of White's." I smiled to myself as he said it, but I remembered in a moment that the man, if he were really what he claimed to be, and I make no doubt that he was, must have been sorely put to it before he urged the fact as a guarantee of his respectability to a total stranger at a Brindisi hotel. That evening, as we cleared the red and green harbor lights of Brindisi, Colvin explained. This is his story, in his own words. When I was traveling in India some years ago, I made the acquaintance of a youngish man in the woods and forests. We camped out together for a week, and I found him a pleasant companion. John Broughton was a light-hearted soul when off duty, but a steady and capable man in any of the small emergencies that continually arise in that department. He was liked and trusted by the natives, and though a trifle over-pleased with himself when he escaped to civilization at Simla or Calcutta, Broughton's future was well assured in government service when a fair-sized estate was unexpectedly left to him, and he joyfully shook the dust off the Indian plains from his feet and returned to England. For 5 years he drifted about London. I saw him now and then. We dined together about every 18 months, and I could trace pretty exactly the gradual sickening of Broughton with a merely idle life. He then set out on a couple of long voyages, returned as restless as before, and at last told me that he had decided to marry and settle down at this place, Thurnley Abbey, which had long been empty. He spoke about looking after the property and standing for his constituency in the usual way. Vivian Wilde, his fiancée, had, I suppose, begun to take him in hand. She was a pretty girl with a deal of fair hair and a rather exclusive manner. Deeply religious in a narrow school, she was still kindly and high-spirited, and I thought that Broughton was in luck. He was quite happy and full of information about his future. Among other things, I asked him about Thurnley Abbey. He confessed that he hardly knew the place. The last tenant, a man called Clark, had lived in one wing for 15 years and seen no one. He had been a miser and a hermit. It was the rarest thing for a light to be seen at the Abbey after dark. Only the barest necessities of life were ordered, and the tenant himself received them at the side door. His one half-caste manservant, after a month's stay in the house, had abruptly left without warning, and had returned to the southern states. One thing Broughton complained bitterly about: Clark had wilfully spread the rumor among the villagers that the abbey was haunted, and had even condescended to play childish tricks with spirit lamps and salt in order to scare trespassers away at night. He had been detected in the act of this tomfoolery, but the story spread, and no one, said Broughton, would venture near the house except in broad daylight. The hauntedness of Thurnley Abbey was now, he said with a grin, part of the gospel of the countryside. But he and his young wife were going to change all that. I would propose myself any time I liked. I, of course, said I would, and equally, of course, intended to do nothing of the sort without a definite invitation. The house was put in thorough repair, though not a stick of the old furniture and tapestry were removed. Floors and ceilings were relaid, the roof was made watertight again, and the dust of half a century was scoured out. He showed me some photographs of the place. It was called an abbey, though as a matter of fact it had been only the infirmary of the long-vanished Abbey of Gloucester, some 5 miles away. The larger part of the building remained as it had been in pre-Reformation days, but a wing had been added in Jacobean times, and that part of the house had been kept in something like repair by Mr. Clark. He had in both the ground and first floors set a heavy timber door, strongly barred with iron. In the passage between the earlier and the Jacobean parts of the house, and had entirely neglected the former. So there had been a good deal of work to be done. Broughton, whom I saw in London 2 or 3 times about this period, made a deal of fun over the positive refusal of the workmen to remain after sundown. Even after the electric light had been put into every room, nothing would induce them to remain, though, as Broughton observed, electric light was death on ghosts. The legend of the Abbey's ghosts had gone far and wide, and the men would take no risks. They went home in batches of 5 and 6, and even during the daylight hours there was an inordinate amount of talking between one and another, if either happened to be out of sight of his companion. On the whole, though nothing of any sort or kind had been conjured up even by their heated imaginations during their 5 months' work upon the Abbey, the belief in the ghosts was rather strengthened than otherwise in Thurnley because of the men's confessed nervousness, and local tradition declared itself in favor of the ghost of an immured nun. "Good old nun," said Broughton. I asked him whether in general he believed in the possibility of ghosts, and rather to my surprise he said that he couldn't say he entirely disbelieved in them. A man in India had told him one morning in camp that he believed that his mother was dead in England, as her vision had come to his tent the night before. He had not been alarmed, but had said nothing, and the figure vanished again. As a matter of fact, the next possible dakwala brought on a telegram announcing the mother's death. There the thing was, said Broughton. But at Thurnley he was practical enough. He roundly cursed the idiotic selfishness of Clark, whose silly antics had caused all the inconvenience. At the same time, he couldn't refuse to sympathize to some extent with the ignorant workman. My own idea, said he, is that if a ghost ever does come in one's way, one ought to speak to it. I agreed, little as I knew of the ghost world and its conventions. I had always remembered that a spook was in honor bound to wait to be spoken to. It didn't seem much to do, and I felt that the sound of one's own voice would at any rate reassure oneself as to one's wakefulness. But there are few ghosts outside Europe, few, that is, that a white man can see, and I had never been troubled with any. However, as I said, I told Broughton that I agreed. So the wedding took place, and I went to it in a tall hat which I bought for the occasion, and the new Mrs. Broughton smiled very nicely at me afterwards. As it had to happen, I took the Orient Express that evening, and was not in England again for nearly 6 months. Just before I came back, I got a letter from Broughton. He asked if I could see him in London or come to Thurnley, as he thought I should be better able to help him than anyone else he knew. His wife sent a nice message to me at the end, so I was reassured about at least one thing. I wrote from Budapest that I would come and see him at Thurnley 2 days after my arrival in London. As I sauntered out of the Pannonia and into Kerespesi Utska to post my letters, I wondered of what earthly service I could be to Broughton. I had been out with him after Tiger on foot. I could imagine few men better able to pinch to manage their own business. However, I had nothing to do. So, after dealing with some small accumulations of business during my absence, I packed a kit bag and departed for Euston. I was met by Broughton's great limousine at Thurnley Road Station, and after a drive of nearly 7 miles we echoed through the sleepy streets of Thurnley village, into which the main gates of the park thrust themselves, splendid with pillars and spread-eagles and tomcats rampant atop them. I never was a herald, but I know that the Broughtons have the right to supporters. Heaven knows why. From the gates, a quadruple avenue of beech trees led inwards for a 1/4 mile. Beneath them, a neat strip of fine turf edged the road and ran back until the poison of the dead beech leaves killed it under the trees. There were many wheel tracks on the road, and a comfortable little pony trap jogged past me laden with a country parson and his wife and daughter. Evidently there was some garden party going on at the Abbey. The road dropped away to the right at the end of the avenue, and I could see the Abbey across a wide pasturage and a brown lawn thickly dotted with guests. The end of the building was plain. It must have been almost mercilessly austere when it was first built, but time had crumbled the edges and toned the stone down to an orange-lichened gray wherever it showed behind its curtain of magnolia, jasmine, and ivy. Farther on was the 3-story Jacobean house, tall and handsome. There had not been the slightest attempt to adapt one to the other, but the kindly ivy had glossed over the touching point. There was a tall fletch in the middle of the building, surmounting a small bell tower. Behind the house there rose the mountainous verdure of Spanish chestnuts all the way up the hill. Broughton had seen me coming from afar and walked across from his other guests to welcome me before turning me over to the butler's care. This man was sandy-haired and rather inclined to be talkative. He could, however, answer hardly any questions about the house. He had, he said, only been there 3 weeks. Mindful of what Broughton had told me, I made no inquiries about ghosts, though the room into which I was shown might have justified anything. It was a very large, low room with oak beams projecting from the white ceiling. Every inch of the walls, including the doors, was covered with tapestry, and a remarkably fine Italian 4-post bedstead, heavily draped, added to the darkness and the dignity of the place. All the furniture was old, well-made, and dark. Underfoot there was a plain green pile carpet, the only new thing about the room except the electric light fittings and jugs and basins. Even the looking-glass on the dressing table was an old pyramidal Venetian glass set in a heavy Rapusi frame of tarnished silver. Whew. Got a damn vocabulary on him. After a few minutes cleaning up, I went downstairs and out upon the lawn, where I greeted my hostess. The people gathered there were of the usual country type, all anxious to be pleased and roundly curious as to the new master of the Abbey. Rather to my surprise and quite to my pleasure, I rediscovered Glenham, whom I had known well in old days in Barrowstland. He lived quite close, as he remarked with a grin. I ought to have known. But, he added, I don't live in a place like this. He swept his hand to the long, low lines of the abbey in obvious admiration, and then, to my intense interest, muttered beneath his breath, Thank God. He saw that I had overheard him, and turning to me said decidedly, Yes, thank God. I said, and I meant it. I wouldn't live at the abbey for all Broughton's money. But surely, I demurred, you know that old Clark was discovered in the very act of setting light on his bugaboos. Glenham shrugged his shoulders. Yes, I know about that, but there is something wrong with the place still. All I can say is that Broughton is a different man since he's lived here. I don't believe that he will remain much longer, but you're staying here? Well, you'll hear all about it tonight. There's a big dinner, I understand. The conversation turned off to old reminiscences, and Glenham soon after had to go. Before I went to dress that evening, I had 20 minutes' talk with Broughton in his library. There was no doubt that the man was altered, gravely altered. He was nervous and fidgety, and I found him looking at me only when my eye was off him. I naturally asked him what he wanted of me. I told him I would do anything I could, but that I couldn't conceive what he lacked that I could provide. He said with a lustrous smile that there was, however, something, and that he would tell me in the following morning. It struck me that he was somehow ashamed of himself, and perhaps ashamed of the part he was asking me to play. However, I dismissed the subject from my mind and went up to dress in my palatial room. As I shut the door, a draught blew out the Queen of Sheba from the wall, and I noticed that the tapestries were not fastened to the wall at the bottom. I have always held very practical views about spooks, and it has often seemed to me that the slow waving in firelight of loose tapestry upon a wall would account for 99% of the stories one hears. Certainly, the dignified undulation of this lady with her attendants and huntsmen, one of whom was untidily cutting the throat of a fallow deer upon the very steps on which King Solomon, a grey-faced Flemish nobleman with the Order of the Golden Fleece, awaited his fair visitor, gave color to my hypothesis. Nothing much happened at dinner. The people were very much like those of the garden party. A young woman sat next to me, seemed anxious to know what I was being read in London. As she was far more familiar than I with the most recent magazines and literary supplements, I found salvation in being myself instructed in the tendencies of modern fiction. All true art, she said, was shot through and through with melancholy. How vulgar were the attempts at wit that marked so many modern books. From the beginning of literature, it has always been tragedy that embodied the highest attainment of every age. To call such works morbid merely begged the question. No thoughtful man, she looked sternly at me through the steel rim of her glasses, could fail to agree with me. Of course, as one would, I immediately and properly said that I slept with Pat Ridge and Jacobs under my pillow at night, and that if Jorrocks weren't quite so large and cornery, I would add him to the company. She hadn't read any of them, so I was saved for a time. But I remember grimly that she said that the dearest wish of her life was to be in some awful and soul-freezing situation of horror, and I remember that she dealt hardly with the hero of Nat Painter's vampire story between nibbles at her brown bread ice. She was a cheerless soul, and I couldn't help thinking that if there were many such in the neighborhood, It was not surprising that old Glenham had been stuffed with some nonsense or other about the Abbey. Yet nothing could have been less creepy than the glitter of silver and glass and the subdued lights and cackle of conversation all round the dinner table. After the ladies had gone, I found myself talking to the rural dean. He was a thin, earnest man who at once turned the conversation to old Clark's buffooneries. But he said Mr. Broughton had introduced such new and cheerful spirit, not only into the Abbey, but, he might say, into the whole neighborhood, that he had great hopes that the ignorant superstitions of the past were from henceforth destined to oblivion. Thereupon his other neighbor, a portly gentleman of independent means and position, audibly remarked, "Amen," which damped the rural dean, and we talked to partridges past, partridges present, and pheasants to come. At the other end of the table, Broughton sat with a couple of his friends, red-faced hunting men. Once I noticed that they were discussing me, but I paid no attention to it at the time. I remembered it a few hours later. By 11 all the guests were gone, and Broughton, his wife, and I were alone together under the fine plaster ceiling of the Jacobean drawing-room. Mrs. Broughton talked about one or two of the neighbors, and then, with a smile, she said that she knew I would excuse her, shook hands with me, and went off to bed. I am not very good at analyzing things, but I felt that she talked a little uncomfortably, and with a suspicion of effort smiled rather conveniently, and was obviously glad to go. These things seemed trifling enough to repeat, but I had throughout the faint feeling that everything was not quite square. Under the circumstances, this was enough to set me wondering what on earth the service could be that I was to render. Wondering also whether the whole business were not some ill-advised jest in order to make me come down from London for a mere shooting party. Broughton said little after she had gone, but he was evidently laboring to bring the conversation round to the so-called haunting of the Abbey. As soon as I saw this, of course I asked him directly about it. He then seemed at once to lose interest in the matter. There was no doubt about it. Broughton was somehow a changed man, and to my mind he had changed in no way for the better. Mrs. Broughton seemed no sufficient cause. He was clearly very fond of her, and she of him. I reminded him that he was going to tell me what I could do for him in the morning, pleaded my journey, lighted a candle, and went upstairs with him. At the end of the passage leading into the old house, he grinned weakly and said, "Mind if you see a ghost, do talk to it. You said you would." He stood irresolutely a moment, and then turned away. At the door of his dressing-room, he paused once more. "I'm here," he called out, "if you should want anything. Good night." And he shut the door. I went along the passage to my room, undressed, switched on a lamp beside my bed, read a few pages of the Jungle Book, and then, more than ready for sleep, turned the light off and went fast asleep. 3 hours later I woke up. There was not a breath of wind outside. There was not even a flicker of light from the fireplace. As I lay there, an ash tinkled slightly as it cooled, but there was hardly a gleam of the dullest red on the grate. An owl cried among the silent Spanish chestnuts on the slope outside. I idly reviewed the events of the day, hoping, that I should fall off to sleep again before I reached dinner. But at the end I seemed as wakeful as ever. There was no help for it. I must read my Jungle Book again till I felt ready to go off. So I fumbled for the pear at the end of the cord that hung down inside the bed, and I switched on the bedside lamp. The sudden glory dazzled me for a moment. I felt under my pillow for my book with half-shut eyes. Then, growing used to the light, I happened to look down at the foot of my bed. I can never tell you really when happened then. Nothing I could ever confess in the most abject words could even faintly picture to you what I felt. I know that my heart stopped dead, and my throat shut automatically. In one instinctive moment, I crouched back up against the headboards of the bed, staring at the horror. The movement set my heart going again, and the sweat dripped from every pore. I am not a particularly religious man, but I had always believed that God would never allow any supernatural appearance to present itself to a man in such a guise and in such circumstances that harm, either bodily or mental, could result to him. I can only tell you that at the moment both my life and my reason rocked unsteadily in their seats. The other Osiris passengers had gone. Only he and I remained leaning over the starboard railing, which rattled uneasily now and then under the fierce vibration of the over-engined mailboat. Far over there were the lights of a few fishing smacks riding out the night, and a great rush of white combing and seething waterfall out away from us, overside. At last Colvin went on. Leaning over the foot of my bed, looking at me, was a figure swathed in rotten and tattered veiling. This shroud passed over the head, but left both eyes and the right side of the face bare. It then followed the line of the arm down to where the hand grasped the bed end. The face was not entirely that of a skull. Though the eyes and the flesh of the face were totally gone, there was a thin, dry skin drawn tightly over the features, and there was some skin left on the hand. One wisp of hair crossed the forehead. It was perfectly still. I looked at it, and it looked at me, and my brains turned dry and hot in my head. I had still got the pair of the electric lamp in my hand, and I played idly with it. Only I dared not turn the light out again. I shut my eyes, only to open them in hideous terror the same second. The thing had not moved. My heart was thumping, and the sweat cooled me as it evaporated. Another cinder tinkled in the grate, and a panel creaked in the wall. My reason failed me. For 20 minutes or 20 seconds I was able to think of nothing else but this awful figure, till there came, hurtling through the empty channels of my senses, the remembrances that Broughton and his friends had discussed me furtively at dinner. The dim possibility of its being a hoax stole gratefully into my unhappy mind, and once there, one's pluck came creeping back along 1,000 tiny vines. My first sensation was one of blind, unreasoning thankfulness that my brain was going to stand the trial. I am not a timid man, but the best of us needs some human handle to steady him in time of extremity, and in this faint but growing hope that after all it might be only a brutal hoax, I found the fulcrum that I needed, and last I moved. How I managed to do it, I cannot tell you. But with one spring towards the foot of the bed, I got within arm's length and struck out one fearful blow with my fist at the thing. It crumbled under it, and my hand was cut to the bone. With a sickening revulsion after my terror, I dropped, half fainting, across the end of the bed, so it was merely a foul trick after all. No doubt the trick had been played many a time before. No doubt Broughton and his friends had had some large bet amongst themselves as to what I should do when I discovered the gruesome thing. From my state of abject terror, I found myself transported an insensate anger. I shouted curses upon Broughton. I dived rather than climbed over the end of the sofa. I tore at the robed skeleton. How well the whole thing had been carried out, I thought. I broke the skull against the floor and stamped upon its dry bones. I flung the head away under the bed and rent the brittle bones of the trunk in pieces. I snapped the thin thigh bones across my knee and flung them in different directions. The shin bones I set up against a stool and broke with my heel. I raged like a berserker against the loathly thing, and stripped the ribs from the backbone and slung the breastbone against the cupboard. My fury increased as the work of destruction went on. I tore the frail, rotten veil into 20 pieces, and the dust went up over everything, over the cleaning blotting paper and silver inkstand. At last my work was done. There was but a raffle of broken bones and strips of parchment and crumbling wool. Then, picking up a piece of the skull, it was the cheek and the temple of the bone of the right side. I remember I opened the door and went down the passage to Broughton's dressing room. I remember still how my sweat-dripping pajamas clung to me as I walked. At the door, I kicked and entered. Broughton was in his bed. He had already turned the light on and seemed shrunken and horrified. For a moment he could hardly pull himself together. Then I spoke. I don't know what I said. Only I know that from a heart full and overfull with hatred and contempt, spurred on by shame of my own recent cowardice, I let my tongue run on. He answered nothing. I was amazed at my own fluency. My hair still clung lankly to my wet temples. My hand was bleeding profusely, and I must have looked a strange sight. Broughton huddled himself up at the head of the bed just as I had. Still he made no answer, no defense. He seemed preoccupied with something besides my reproaches, and once or twice moistened his lips with his tongue. But he could say nothing, though he moved his hands now and then, just as a baby who cannot speak moves its hands. At last the door into Mrs. Broughton's rooms opened, and she came in, white and terrified. "What is it? What is it? Oh, in God's name, what is it?" she cried again and again. And then she went up to her husband and sat on the bed in her nightdress, and the two faced me. I told her what the matter was. I spared her husband not a word for her presence there, yet he seemed hardly to understand. I told the pair that I had spoiled their cowardly joke for them. Broughton looked up. "I have smashed the foul thing into 100 pieces," I said. Broughton licked his lips again, and his mouth worked. "By God," I shouted, "it would serve you right if I thrashed you within an inch of your life. I will take care that not a decent man or woman of my acquaintance ever speaks to you again. And there," I added, throwing the broken piece of the skull upon the floor beside his bed, "there is a souvenir for you of your damned work tonight." Broughton saw the bone, and in a moment it was his turn to frighten me. He squealed like a hare caught in a trap. He screamed and screamed till Mrs. Broughton, almost half bewildered as myself, held on to him and coaxed him like a child to be quiet. But Broughton, and as he moved, I thought that 10 minutes ago I perhaps looked as terribly ill as he did, thrust her from him, and scrambled out of bed onto the floor, and still screaming, put his hand to the bone. It had blood on it from my hand. He paid no attention to me whatever. In truth, I said nothing. This was a new turn, indeed, to the horrors of that evening. He rose from the floor with the bone in his hand and stood silent. He seemed to be listening. Time, perhaps, he muttered, and almost at the same moment fell at full length on the carpet, cutting his head against the fender. The bone flew from his hand and came to rest near the door. I picked Broughton up, haggard and broken with blood over his face. He whispered hoarsely and quickly, "Listen, listen." We listened. After 10 seconds' utter quiet, I seemed to hear something. I could not be sure, but at last there was no doubt. There was a quiet sound as one moving along the passage. Little regular steps came toward us over the hard oak flooring. Broughton moved to where his wife sat, white and speechless, on the bed, and pressed her face into his shoulder. Then, the last thing that I could see as he turned the light out, he fell toward with his own head pressed to the pillow of the bed. Something in their company, something in their cowardice helped me, and I faced the open doorway of the room, which was outlined fairly clearly against the dim-lighted passage. I put out one hand and touched Mrs. Broughton's shoulder in the darkness. But at the last moment, I, too, failed. I sank on my knees and put my face in the bed. Only we all heard the footsteps came to the door, and there they stopped. The piece of bone was lying a yard inside the door. There was a rustle of moving stuff, and the thing was in the room. Mrs. Broughton was silent. I could hear Broughton's voice praying, muffled in the pillow. I was cursing my own cowardice. Then the steps moved out again on the oak boards of the passage, and I heard the sounds dying away. In a flash of remorse, I went to the door and looked out. At the end of the corridor, I saw something that moved away. A moment later, the passage was empty. I stood with my forehead against the jamb of the door, almost physically sick. "You can turn the light on," I said, and there was an answering flare. There was no bone at my feet. Mrs. Broughton had fainted. Broughton was almost useless, and it took me 10 minutes to bring her to. Broughton only said one thing worth remembering. For the most part, he went on muttering prayers, but I was glad afterwards to recollect that he said that thing. He said in a colorless voice, half as a question, half as reproach, "You didn't speak to her." We spent the remainder of the night together. Mrs. Broughton actually fell off into a kind of sleep before dawn, but she suffered so horribly in her dreams that I shook her into consciousness again. Never was dawn so long in coming. 3 or 4 times Broughton spoke to himself. Mrs. Broughton would then just tighten her hold on his arm, but she could say nothing. As for me, I can honestly say that I grew worse as the hours passed and the light strengthened. The 2 violent reactions had battered down my steadiness of view, and I felt that the foundations of my life had been built upon the sand. I said nothing, and after binding up my hand with a towel, I did not move. It was better so. They helped me, and I helped them, and we all three knew that our reason had gone very near to ruin that night. At last, when the light came in pretty strongly, and the birds outside were chattering and singing, we felt that we must do something. Yet we never moved. You might have thought that we should particularly dislike being found as we were by the servants, yet nothing of that kind mattered a straw, and an overpowering listlessness bound us as we sat, until Chapman, Broughton's man, actually knocked and opened the door. None of us moved. Broughton, speaking hardly and stiffly, said, "Chapman, you can come back in 5 minutes." Chapman was a discreet man, but would have made no difference to us if he had carried his news to the room at once. We looked at each other, and I said I must go back. I meant to wait outside till Chapman returned. I simply dared not re-enter my bedroom alone. Broughton roused himself and said that he would come with me. Mrs. Broughton agreed to remain in her own room for 5 minutes if the blinds were drawn up and all the doors left open. So Broughton and I, leaning stiffly one against the other, went down to my room. By the morning light that filtered past the blinds, we could see our way, and I released the blinds. There was nothing wrong with the room from end to end, except smears of my own blood on the end of the bed, on the sofa, and on the carpet where I had torn the thing to pieces. Colvin had finished his story. There was nothing to say. 7 bells stuttered out from the forecastle, and the answering cry wailed through the darkness. I took him downstairs. Of course, I am much better now, but it is a kindness of you to let me sleep in your cabin. Well, how do we think? That one really got you? Yeah, it's a good one. It's a good one. I really liked it. I sat down and read that one. I sat down and read that one last night when I picked it, when I decided that I was going to read it. Indeed. Spooky. Thank you. I'm glad you guys enjoyed it. That is what I aimed for. You're very welcome. They knew how to write ghost stories back then. It's 9:59. That's not bad. So I gotta sit down and plan out Bridge to Terabithia tonight. Or tomorrow, actually. I was going to do that. Lake George. I have been to Lake George, New York. I have been there. Spent a fair amount of time of my childhood out in that area of New York. That is a beautiful area. Beautiful area. I haven't been camping in years, which I wish I could change that. But getting my 20-year-old daughter to sleep in a tent is like... Hello, Christine. Good evening to you. All right. Well, Now we leave the shadowed halls of Thurnley Abbey for another house, equally silent and equally unwilling to let the past rest. A house where every hallway, every staircase, every closed door seems to be waiting. This is The Empty House by Algernon Blackwood. I know, it's twice. I didn't have to wait for somebody to yell at me to click the button. I'm getting better. Certain houses, like certain persons, manage somehow to proclaim at once their character for evil. In the case of the latter, no particular feature need betray them. They may boast an open countenance and an ingenuous smile, and yet a little of their company leaves the unalterable conviction that there is something radically amiss with their being, that they are evil. Willy-nilly they seem to communicate an atmosphere of secret and wicked thoughts which makes those in their immediate neighborhood shrink from them as from a thing diseased. And perhaps with houses the same principle is operative, and it is the aroma of evil deeds committed under a particular roof long after the actual doers have passed away that makes the goose flesh come, and the hair rise. Something of the original passion of the evildoer and of the horror felt by his victim enters the heart of the innocent watcher, and he becomes suddenly conscious of tingling nerves, creeping skin, and a chilling of the blood. He is terror-stricken, without apparent cause. What is the aroma of evil deeds? It is rotten egg farts. Actually, no, it's broccoli farts. Broccoli dog farts. Oh, dog farts are the worst. There was manifestly nothing in the external appearance of this particular house to bear out the tales of the horror that was said to reign within. It was neither lonely nor unkempt. It stood, crowded into a corner of the square, and looked exactly like the houses on either side of it. It had the same number of windows as its neighbors, the same balcony overlooking the gardens, the same white steps leading up to the heavy black front door, and in the rear there was the same narrow strip of green, with neat box borders running up the wall that divided it from the backs of the adjoining houses. Apparently, too, the number of chimney pots on the roof was the same. The breadth and angle of the eaves, and even the height of the dirty area railings. And yet this house in the square, that seemed precisely similar to its 50 ugly neighbors, was a matter of fact entirely different. Horribly different. Wherein lay this marked invisible difference is impossible to say. It cannot be ascribed wholly to the imagination, because persons who had spent some time in the house, knowing nothing of the facts, had declared positively that certain rooms were so disagreeable that they would rather die than enter them again, and that the atmosphere of the whole house produced in them symptoms of genuine terror, while the series of innocent tenants who had tried to live in it had been forced to decamp at the shortest possible notice, was indeed little less than a scandal in the town. When Shorthouse arrived to pay a weekend visit to his Aunt Julia in her little house on the seafront at the other end of the town, he found her charged to the brim with mystery and excitement. He had only received her telegram that morning, and he had come anticipating boredom. But the moment he touched her hand and kissed her apple-skin-wrinkled cheek, he caught the first wave of her electrical condition. The impression deepened when he learned that there were to be no other visitors, and that he had been telegraphed for with a very special object. Something was in the wind, and the something was would doubtless bear fruit, for this elderly spinster aunt, with a mania for psychical research, had brains as well as willpower, and by hook or by crook she usually managed to accomplish her ends. The revelation was made soon after tea, when she sidled up close to him as they paced slowly around the seafront in dusk. "I've got the keys," she announced in a delighted yet half-awesome voice. "Got them till Monday." "The keys of the bathing machine? Or—" he asked innocently, looking from the sea to the town. Nothing brought her so quickly to the point as feigning stupidity. "Neither," she whispered. "I've got the keys of the haunted house in the square, and I'm going there tonight." Shorthouse was conscious of the slightest possible tremor down his back. He dropped his teasing tone. Something in her voice and manner thrilled him. She was in earnest. "But you can't go alone," he began. "That's why I wired you," she said with decision. He turned to look at her. The ugly, lined, enigmatical face was alive with excitement. There was the glow of genuine enthusiasm round it like a halo. The eyes shone. He caught another wave of her excitement, and a second tremor more marked than the first accompanied it. "Thanks, Aunt Julia," he said. "Thanks awfully." "I should not dare to go quite alone," she went on, raising her voice. "But with you I should enjoy it immensely. You're afraid of nothing, I know." "Thanks so much," he said again. Is anything likely to happen?" "A great deal has happened," she whispered, "though it's been most cleverly hushed up. 3 tenants have come and gone in the last few months, and the house is said to be empty for good now." In spite of himself, Shorthouse became interested. His aunt was so very much in earnest. "The house is very old indeed," she went on, "and the story, an unpleasant one, dates a long way back. It has to do with a murder committed by a jealous stableman who had some affair with a servant in the house. One night he managed to secrete himself in the cellar, and when everyone was asleep, he crept upstairs to the servants' quarters, chased the girl down to the next landing, and before anyone could come to the rescue, threw her bodily over the banisters into the hall below." "And the stableman?" "Was caught, I believe, and hanged for murder. But it all happened a century ago, and I've not been able to get more details of the story." Shorthouse now felt his interest thoroughly aroused, but though he was not particularly nervous for himself, he hesitated a little on his aunt's account. "On one condition," he said at length. "Nothing will prevent my going," she said firmly, "but I may as well hear your condition." "That you guarantee your power of self-control if anything really horrible happens. I mean that you are sure you won't get too frightened." "Jim," she said scornfully, "I'm not young. I know, nor are my nerves, but with you I should be afraid of nothing in the world." This, of course, settled it, for Shorthouse had no pretensions to being other than a very ordinary young man, and an appeal to his vanity was irresistible. He agreed to go. Instinctively, by a sort of subconscious preparation, he kept himself and his forces well in hand the whole evening, compelling an accumulative reserve of control by that nameless inward process of gradually putting all the emotions away and turning the key upon them. A process difficult to describe, but wonderfully effective, as all men who have lived through severe trials of the inner man well understand. Later, it stood him in good stead. But it was not until 10:30, when they stood in the hall, well in glare of friendly lamps and still surrounded by comforting human influences, that he had to make the first call upon his store of collected strength. For once the door was closed, and he saw the deserted, silent street stretching away white in the moonlight before them, it came to him clearly that the real test that night would be in dealing with two fears instead of one. He would have to carry his aunt's fear as well as his own, and as he glanced down at her sphinx-like countenance and realized that it might assume no pleasant aspect in a rush of real terror, he felt satisfied with only one thing in the whole adventure, that he had confidence in his own will and power to stand against any shock that might come. Slowly they walked along the empty streets of the town. A bright autumn moon silvered the roofs, casting deep shadows that were no breath of wind, and the trees in the formal gardens by the seafront watched them silently as they passed along. To his aunt's occasional remarks, Shorthouse made no reply, realizing that she was simply surrounding herself with mental buffers, saying ordinary things to prevent herself thinking of extraordinary things. Few windows showed lights, and from scarcely a single chimney came smoke or sparks. Shorthouse had already begun to notice everything, even the smallest details. Presently they stopped at a street corner and looked up at the name on the side of the house, full in the moonlight, and with one accord, without remark, turned into the square and crossed over to the side of it that lay in shadow. "The number of the house is 13, whispered a voice at his side, and neither of them made the obvious reference, but passed across the broad street of moonlight and began to march up the pavement in silence. It was about halfway up the square that Shorthouse felt an arm slipped quietly but significantly into his own, and knew then that their adventure had begun in earnest, and that his companion was already yielding imperceptibly to the influences against them. She needed support. A few minutes later they stopped before a tall, narrow house that rose before them in the night, ugly in shape and painted a dingy white. Shutterless windows without blinds stared down upon them, shining here and there in the moonlight. There were weather streaks in the wall and cracks in the paint, and the balcony bulged out from the first floor a little unnaturally. But beyond this generally forlorn appearance of an unoccupied house, there was nothing at first sight to single out this particular mansion for the evil character it had most certainly acquired. Taking a look over their shoulders to make sure they had not been followed, they went boldly up the steps and stood against the huge black door that fronted them forbiddingly. But the first wave of nervousness was now upon them, and Shorthouse fumbled a long time with the key before he could fit it into the lock at all. For a moment, if truth were told, they both hoped it would not open, for they were a prey to various unpleasant emotions as they stood there on the threshold of their ghostly adventure. Shorthouse, shuffling with the key and hampered by the steady weight on his arm, certainly felt the solemnity of the moment. It was as if the whole world, for all experience seemed at that instant concentrated on his own consciousness, were listening to the grating noise of the key. A stray puff of wind wandering down the empty street woke a momentary rustling in the trees behind them. But otherwise this rattling of the key was the only sound audible. And at last it turned in the lock, and the heavy door swung open and revealed a yawning gulf of darkness beyond. With a last glance at the moonlit square, they passed quickly in, and the door slammed behind them with a roar that echoed prodigiously through the empty halls and passages. But instantly, with the echoes, another sound made itself heard, and Aunt Julia leaned suddenly so heavily upon him that he had to take a step backwards to save himself from falling. A man had coughed close beside them, so close that it seemed they must have been actually by his side in the darkness. With the possibility of practical jokes in his mind, Shorthouse at once swung his heavy stick in the direction of the sound, but it met nothing more than solid air. He heard his aunt give a little gasp beside him. "There's someone here," she whispered. "I heard him." "Be quiet," he said sternly. "It was nothing but the noise of the front door." "Oh, get a light, quick," she added, as her nephew, fumbling with a box of matches, opened it upside down and let them all fall with a rattle on the stone floor. The sound, however, was not repeated, and there was no evidence of retreating footsteps. In another minute they had a candle burning using an empty end of a cigar case as a holder. And when the first flare had died down, he held the impromptu lamp aloft and surveyed the scene. And it was dreary enough in all conscience, for there was nothing more desolate in all the abodes of men than an unfurnished house, dimly lit, silent, and forsaken, and yet tenanted by rumor, with the memories of evil and violent histories. They were standing in a wide hallway. On their left was the open door of a spacious dining room, and in front the hall ran, ever narrowing into a long, dark passage that led, apparently, to the top of the kitchen stairs. The broad, uncarpeted staircase rose in a sweep before them, everywhere draped in shadows, except for a single spot about halfway up where the moonlight came in through the window and fell on a bright patch on the boards. This shaft of light shed a faint radiance above and below it, lending to the objects within its reach a misty outline that was infinitely more suggestive and ghostly than complete darkness. Filtered moonlight always seems to paint faces on the surrounding gloom, and as Shorthouse peered up into the well of darkness and thought of the countless empty rooms and passages in the upper part of the old house, he caught himself longing again for the safety of the moonlit square, or the cozy, bright drawing-room they had left an hour before. Then, realizing that these thoughts were dangerous, he thrust them away again and summoned all his energy for concentration on the present. "Aunt Julia," he said aloud, severely, "we must now go through the house from top to bottom and make a thorough search." The echoes of his voice died away slowly over the building, and in the intense silence that followed he turned to look at her. In the candlelight he saw that her face was already ghastly pale, but she dropped his arm for a moment and said in a whisper, stepping close to him, "I agree. We must be sure there's no one hiding. That's the first thing." She spoke with evident effort, and he looked at her with admiration. You feel quite sure of yourself? It's not too late." "I think so," she whispered, her eyes shifting nervously toward the shadows behind. "Quite sure. Only one thing." "What's that?" "You must never leave me alone for an instant." "As long as you understand that any sound or appearance must be investigated at once, for to hesitate means to admit fear. That is fatal." "Agreed," she said, a little shakily after a moment's hesitation. "I'll try." Arm in arm, Shorthouse holding the dripping candle and the stick, while his aunt carried the cloak over his shoulders, figures of utter comedy to all but themselves, they began a systematic search. Stealthily walking on tiptoe and shading the candle lest it should betray their presence through the shutterless windows, they went first into the big dining room. There was not a stick of furniture to be seen. Bare walls, ugly mantelpieces, and empty grates stared at them. Everything they felt resented their intrusion, watching them, as it were, with veiled eyes. Whispers followed them. Shadows flitted noiselessly to the right and left. Something seemed ever at their back, watching, waiting an opportunity to do them injury. There was the inevitable sense that operations which went on when the room was empty, and had temporarily suspended till they were well out of the way again. The whole dark interior of the building seemed to become a malignant presence that rose up, warning them to desist and mind their own business. Every moment the strain on the nerves increased. Out of the gloomy dining room they passed through large folding doors into a sort of library or smoking room, wrapped equally in silence, darkness, and dust. And from this they regained the hall near the top of the back stairs. Here a pitch-black tunnel opened before them into the lower regions, and it must be confessed, they hesitated. But only for a moment. With the worst of the night still to come, it was essential to turn from nothing. Aunt Julia stumbled at the top step of the dark descent, ill-lit by the flickering candle, and even Shorthouse felt at least half the decision go out of his legs. "Come on," he said peremptorily, and his voice ran on and lost itself in the dark, empty spaces below. "I'm coming," she faltered, catching his arm with unnecessary violence. They went a little unsteadily down the stone steps, a cold, damp air meeting them in the face, close and malodorous. The kitchen into which the stairs led along a narrow passage was large with a lofty ceiling. Several doors opened out of it, some into cupboards with empty jars still standing on the shelves, and others into horrible little ghostly back offices, each colder and less inviting than the last. Black beetles scurried over the floor, and once, when they knocked against a deal table standing in a corner, something about the size of a cat jumped down with a rush and fled, scampering across the stone floor into the darkness. Everywhere there was a sense of recent occupation, an impression of sadness and gloom. Leaving the main kitchen, they went towards the scullery. The door was standing ajar, and as they pushed it open to its full extent, Aunt Julia uttered a piercing scream, which she instantly tried to stifle by placing her hand over her mouth. For a second, Shorthouse stood shock-still, catching his breath. He felt as if his spine had suddenly become hollow, and someone had filled it with particles of ice. Facing them directly in their way between the doorposts stood the figure of a woman. She had disheveled hair and wildly staring eyes, and her face was terrified and white as death. She stood there motionless for the space of a single second. Then the candle flickered, and she was gone. Gone utterly, and the door framed nothing but empty darkness. "Only the beastly jumping candlelight," he said quickly in a voice that sounded like someone else's and was only half under control. "Come on, Aunt, there's nothing there." He dragged her forward. With a clattering of feet and a great appearance of boldness they went on, but over his body the skin moved as if crawling ants covered it, and he knew by the weight on his arm that he was supplying the force of locomotion for two. The scullery was cold, bare, and empty, more like a large prison cell than anything else. They went round it, tried the door into the yard and the windows, but found them all fastened securely. His aunt moved beside him like a person in a dream. Her eyes were tightly shut, and she seemed merely to follow the pressure of his arm. Her courage filled him with amazement. At the same time, he noticed that a certain odd change had come over her face, a change which somehow evaded his power of analysis. "There's nothing here, Auntie," he repeated aloud quickly. "Let's go upstairs and see the rest of the house. Then we'll choose a room to wait up in." She followed him obediently, keeping close to his side, and they locked the kitchen door behind them. It was a relief to get up again. In the hall there was more light than before, for the moon had traveled a little farther down the stairs. Cautiously they began to go up into the dark vault of the upper house, the boards creaking under their weight. On the first floor they found the large double drawing rooms, a search of which revealed nothing. Here was no sign of furniture or recent occupancy, nothing but dust and neglect and shadows. They opened the big folding doors between front and back drawing rooms, and then came out again to the landing and went upstairs. They had not gone up more than a dozen steps when they both simultaneously stopped to listen, looking into each other's eyes with a new apprehension across the flickering candle flame. From the room they had left hardly 10 seconds before came the sound of doors quietly closing. It was beyond all question. They heard the booming noises that accompanies the shutting of heavy doors, followed by the sharp catching of the latch. "We must go back and see," said Shorthouse briefly in a low tone, turning to go downstairs again. Somehow she managed to drag after him, her feet catching in her dress, her face livid. When they entered the front drawing room, it was plain that the folding doors had been closed half a minute before. Without hesitation, Shorthouse opened them. He almost expected to see someone facing him in the back room, but only darkness and cold air met him. They went through both rooms, finding nothing unusual. They tried in every way to make the doors close of themselves, but there was not wind enough even to set the candle flame flickering. The doors would not move without strong pressure. All was silent as a grave. Undeniably, the rooms were utterly empty, and the house utterly still. "It's beginning," whispered a voice at his elbow, which he hardly recognized as his aunt's. He nodded acquiescence, taking out his watch to note the time. It was 15 minutes before midnight. He made the entry of exactly what had occurred in his notebook, setting the candle in its case upon the floor in order to do so. It took a moment or two to balance it safely against the wall. Aunt Julia always declared that at this moment she was not actually watching him, but had turned her head towards the inner room where she fancied she heard something moving. But at any rate, both positively agreed that there came a sound of rushing feet, heavy and very swift, and the next instant the candle was out. But to Shorthouse himself had come more than this, and he has always thanked his fortunate stars that it came to him alone, and not to his aunt too. For as he rose from the stooping position of balancing the candle, and before it was actually extinguished, a face thrust itself forward so close to his own that he could almost have touched it with his lips. It was a face working with passion, a man's face, dark with thick features and angry, savage eyes. It belonged to a common man, and it was evil in its ordinary, normal expression, no doubt, but as he saw it, alive with intense, aggressive emotion, it was a malignant and terrible human countenance. There was no movement of the air. Nothing but the sound of rushing feet, stockinged or muffled feet, the apparition of the face, and the almost simultaneous extinguishing of the candle. In spite of himself, Shorthouse uttered a little cry, nearly losing his balance as his aunt clung to him with her whole weight in one moment of real, uncontrollable terror. She made no sound, but simply seized him bodily. Fortunately, however, she had seen nothing, but had only heard the rushing feet, for her control returned almost at once, and he was able to disentangle himself and strike a match. We go to about 11, so about a half hour. The shadows ran away on all sides before the glare, and his aunt stooped down and groped for the cigar case with the precious candle. Then they discovered that the candle had not been blown out at all. It had been crushed out. The wick was pressed down into the wax, which was flattened as if by some smooth, heavy instrument. How his companion so quickly overcame her terror, Shorthouse never properly understood. But his admiration for her self-control increased tenfold, and at the same time served to feed his own dying flame, for which he was undeniably grateful. Equally inexplicable to him was the evidence of physical force that they had just witnessed. He at once suppressed the memory of stories he had heard of physical mediums and their dangerous phenomena, for if these were true, and either his aunt or himself was unwittingly a physical medium, it meant that they were simply aiding the focus of the forces of a haunted house already charged to the brim. It was like walking with unprotected lamps among covered stores of gunpowder. So, with as little reflection as possible, he simply relit the candle and went up to the next floor. The arm in his trembled, it is true, and his own tread was often uncertain, but they went on with thoroughness. And after a search revealing nothing, they climbed the last flight of stairs to the top floor of all. Here they found a perfect nest of small servants' rooms with broken pieces of furniture, dirty cane-bottomed chairs, chests of drawers, cracked mirrors, and decrepit bedsteads. The rooms had low, sloping ceilings already hung here and there with cobwebs, small windows, and badly plastered walls, a depressing and dismal region which they were glad to leave behind. It was on the stroke of midnight when they entered a small room on the third floor close to the top of the stairs, and arranged to make themselves comfortable for the remainder of their adventure. It was absolutely bare, and was said to be the room, then used as a clothes closet, into which the infuriated groom had chased his victim and finally caught her. Outside, across the narrow landing, began the stairs leading up to the floor above and the servants' quarters, where they had just searched. In spite of the chilliness of the night, there was something in the air of this room that cried for an open window, but there was no more than this. Shorthouse could only describe it by saying that he felt less master of himself here than in any other part of the house. There was something that acted directly on the nerves, tiring the resolution, enfeebling the will. He was conscious of this result before he had been in the room 5 minutes, and it was in the short time they stayed there that he suffered the wholesale depletion of his vital forces, which was for himself the chief horror of the whole experience. They put the candle on the floor of the cupboard, leaving the door a few inches ajar so that there was no glare to confuse the eyes, and no shadow to shift about on walls and ceiling. Then they spread the cloak on the floor and sat down to wait, with their backs against the wall. Shorthouse was within 2 feet of the door on the landing. His position commanded a good view of the main staircase leading down into the darkness, and also of the beginning of the servants' stairs going to the floor above. The heavy stick lay beside him within easy reach. The moon was now high above the house. Through the open window they could see the comforting stars like friendly eyes watching in the sky. One by one, the clocks of the town struck midnight, and when the sounds died away, the deep silence of windless night fell again over everything. Only the boom of the sea far away and lugubrious filled the air with hollow murmurs. Inside the house, the silence became awful. Awful, he thought, because any minute now it might be broken by sounds pretending terror. The strain of waiting told more and more severely on the nerves. They talked in whispers when they talked at all, for their voices aloud sounded queer and unnatural. A chilliness, not altogether due to the night air, invaded the room and made them cold. The influences against them, whatever these might be, were slowly robbing them of self-confidence and the power of decisive action. Their forces were on the wane, and the possibility of real fear took on a new and terrible meaning. He began to tremble for the elderly woman by his side, whose pluck could hardly save her beyond a certain extent. He heard the blood singing in his veins. It seemed... Excuse me while I can't talk. Holy crap. You guys are working it. I got the Jim Jams. He heard the blood singing in his veins. It sometimes seemed so loud that he fancied it preventing his
He fancied it prevented his hearing properly certain other sounds that were beginning very faintly to make themselves audible in the depths of the house. Every time he fastened his attention on these sounds, they instantly ceased. They certainly came no nearer. Yet he could not rid themselves of the idea that movement was going on somewhere in the lower regions of the house. The drawing room floor, where the doors had been so strangely closed, seemed too near. The sounds were further off than that. He thought of the great kitchen, with scurrying black beetles, and of the dismal little scullery. But somehow or other they did not seem to come from there either. Surely they were not outside the house. Then, suddenly, the truth flashed into his mind, and for the space of a minute he felt as if his blood had stopped flowing and turned to ice. The sounds were not downstairs at all. They were upstairs, somewhere among those horrid, gloomy little servants' rooms with their bits of broken furniture, low ceilings, and cramped windows, upstairs where the victim had first been disturbed and stalked to her death. And the moment he discovered where the sounds were, he began to hear them more clearly. It was the sound of feet, moving stealthily along the passage overhead, in and out among the rooms and past the furniture. He turned quickly to steal a glance at the motionless figure seated beside him, to note whether she had shared his discovery. The faint candlelight coming through the crack in the cupboard door threw her strongly marked face into vivid relief against the white of the wall. But it was something else that made him catch his breath and stare again. An extraordinary something had come into her face and seemed to spread over her features like a mask. It smoothed out the deep lines and drew the skin everywhere a little tighter so that the wrinkles disappeared. It brought into the face, with the sole exception of the old eyes, an appearance of youth and almost of childhood. He stared in speechless amazement that was dangerously near to horror. It was his aunt's face indeed, but it was her face of 40 years ago, the vacant, innocent face of a girl. He had heard stories of that strange effect of terror which could wipe a human countenance clean of their emotions, obliterating all previous expressions. But he had never realized that it could be literally true, or could mean anything so simply horrible as what he now saw. For the dreadful signature of overmastering fear was written plainly in that utter vacancy of the girlish face beside him. And when, feeling his intense gaze, she turned to look at him, he instinctively closed his eyes tightly to shut out the sight. Yet, when he turned a minute later, his feelings well in hand, he saw to his intense relief another expression. His aunt was smiling, and though the face was deathly white, the awful veil had lifted, and the normal look was returning. "Anything wrong?" was all he could think of to say at that moment, and the answer was eloquent, coming from such a woman. "I feel cold and a little frightened," she whispered. He offered to close the window, but she seized hold of him and begged him not to leave her side even for an instant. "It's upstairs, I know," she whispered with an odd half-laugh, "but I can't possibly go up." But Shorthouse thought otherwise, knowing that in action lay their best hope of self-control. He took the brandy flask and poured out a glass of neat spirit, stiff enough to help anybody over anything. She swallowed it with a shiver. His only idea now was to get out of the house before her collapse became inevitable, but this could not safely be done by turning tail and running from the enemy. Inaction was no longer possible. Every minute he was growing less master of himself, and desperate, aggressive measures were imperative without further delay. Moreover, the action must be taken towards the enemy, not away from it. The climax, if necessary and unavoidable, would have to be faced boldly. He could do it now, but in 10 minutes he might not have the force left to act for himself, much less for both. Upstairs, the sounds were meanwhile becoming louder and closer, accompanied by the occasional creaking of the floorboards. Someone was moving stealthily about, stumbling now and then awkwardly against the furniture. Waiting a few moments to allow the tremendous dose of spirits to produce its effect, and knowing this would last but a short time under the circumstances, Shorthouse then quietly got on his feet, saying in a determined voice, "Now, Aunt Julia, we'll go upstairs and find out what all this noise is about. You must come too. It's what we agreed." He picked up his stick and went to the cupboard for the candle. A limp form rose shakily beside him, breathing hard, and he heard a voice say very faintly something about being ready to come. The woman's courage amazed him. It was so much greater than his own, and as they advanced, holding aloft the dripping candle, some subtle force exhaled from his trembling, white-faced old woman at his side that was the true source of his inspiration. It held something really great that shamed him and gave him the support without which he would have proved far less equal to the occasion. They crossed the dark landing, avoiding with their eyes the deep black space over the banisters. Then they began to mount the narrow staircase to meet the sounds, which minute by minute grew louder and nearer. About halfway up the stairs, Aunt Julia stumbled, and Shorthouse turned to catch her by the arm, and just at that moment there came a terrific crash in the servants' quarter overhead. It was instantly followed by a shrill, agonized scream that was a cry of terror and a cry for help melted into one. Before they could move aside or go down a single step, someone came rushing along the passage overhead, blundering horribly, racing madly at full speed, 3 steps at a time, down the very staircase where they stood. The steps were light and uncertain, but close behind them sounded the heavier tread of another person, and the staircase seemed to shake. Shorthouse and his companion just had time to flatten themselves against the wall when the jumble of flying steps was upon them, and 2 persons with the slightest possible interval between them dashed past at full speed. It was a perfect whirlwind of sound, breaking in upon them upon the midnight silence of the empty building. The 2 runners, pursuer and pursued, had passed clean through them where they stood. And already, with thud, the boards below had received the first one, then the other. Yet they had seen absolutely nothing. Not a hand, or arm, or face, or even a shred of flying clothing. There came a second's pause. Then the first one, the lighter of the 2, obviously the pursued one, ran with uncertain footsteps into the little room which Shorthouse and his aunt had just left. The heavier one followed. There was a sound of scuffling, gasping, and smothered screaming, and then, out on the landing, there came the step of a single person treading weightily. A dead silence followed for the space of half a minute. And then was heard a rushing sound through the air. It was followed by a dull, crashing thud in the depths of the house below, on the stone floor of the hall. Utter silence reigned afterward. Nothing moved. The flame of the candle was steady. It had been steady the whole time, and the air had been undisturbed by any movement whatsoever. Palsied with terror, Aunt Julia, without waiting for her companion, began fumbling her way downstairs. She was crying gently to herself, and when Shorthouse put his arm round her and half carried her, he felt that she was trembling like a leaf. He went into the little room and picked up the cloak from the floor, and arm in arm, walking very slowly without speaking a word or looking once behind them, they marched down the 3 flights into the hall. In the hall they saw nothing. But the whole way down the stairs they were conscious that someone followed them, step by step. When they went faster, it was left behind. And when they went more slowly, it caught them up. But never once did they look behind to see. And at each turning of the staircase they lowered their eyes for fear of the following horror they might see upon the stairs above. With trembling hands, Shorthouse opened the front door, and they walked out into the moonlight and drew a deep breath of the cool night air blowing in from the sea. $105,000 likes. Oh, God, thank you. That's awesome, guys. So what did we think of that one? Gotta have the water. Water, water, water. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Ooh, what was that? Super GG. No, it did end a little abruptly. I'm glad you guys liked it. I enjoyed it. Algernon Blackwood is... I mean, we've actually done 2 of his other stories. We did The Wendigo and The Willows. And they were both fantastic. They were both good. Yeah. I have a whole bunch of his other stories other than The Willows and The Wendigo. So we will maybe I'll do a night of Algernon Blackwood. So I know I've done an evening with Stephen King and an evening with H.P. Lovecraft and all that stuff. And I love doing themed nights, so I was like happy to find 2 really good haunted house stories. So, yeah. I'm not sure what I'm going to read on Friday. I'll find something good. I mean, you guys trust me, so you'll be here with your tapping. Awesome. You guys spoil me. Yeah, I will say Monday passed with flying colors. Monday was really great, and I have you guys to thank for that. And it was a lot of fun too. I mean, it was just, I think, I can't wait for it either, and I hope, and I'm glad you're going to be here. So that's going to open up some new opportunities. Sometimes it's going to be kind of a flex night, is what I've decided. Like if I want to do I would love, there's a couple of books that I would love to read that are, I would love to do like War of the Worlds or The Time Machine. And, those, I mean, they're multiple night books, but I could do them 3 nights and probably finish it, you know? But it wouldn't really, something that doesn't really fit into, well, thank you, Queen of Denial. I appreciate you. It's something that doesn't fit all the way into, doesn't fit into like Sunday. Sundays are still, Sundays, what I told somebody was Sundays are sacred. And that's where this all started. It all started with Sunday night bedtime stories. And that is always going to be what Sundays are. So, yeah, I mean, I want to read some H.G. Wells. I would love to read some George Orwell. There's a book that I like recommend to everybody, but I would love to, the author's name is Alfred Bester. And the book is called The Stars, My Destination. And it's so good. It is so good. And it would be one of those ones that we could finish in 3 or 4 nights. So, it's a fantastic book. It's essentially the Count of Monte Cristo, but in the future in space. It's awesome. It is so good. Yeah, I mean, those I can do more. I can do more Sherlock Holmes. I can do some of even the longer ones. So, Sunday nights, Sundays will always be kids stuff, will be family friendly stuff. And, I might do, I will most likely do Sunday, Monday as family stuff. So like if I want to do a book, yeah, I'm not cool. Like Bridge to Terabithia. That's going to be one that we read in probably 2 nights. But it's so we can do it Sunday and Monday. Good night, Eddie. You're very welcome. I'm glad you were here. So, and then like if it's one that we're kind of casual in, or if I want to break things up, I can read, I can do like a 3-night sci-fi book or a 3-night horror book, or, if we want to do like a 6-night horror book or sci-fi book, we can read Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then we can do the following Monday, Wednesday, Friday too. Just like we do with the with the Sunday night stories, where we were reading them over the course of several weeks. Now we can read those a little bit quicker. So like I said, with Bridge to Terabithia, instead of taking 2 sessions a week apart, we can do them Sunday and Monday. It's like the same with Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator. We could do Sunday, Monday instead of doing Sunday and then making you guys wait until the following Sunday. So, and then, but then if I want to do like a longer horror or sci-fi story, I can take over Monday for that, and we can, do what we used to do with Sundays. So it's going to open up a lot of possibilities, and it still leaves me with 3 days where I'm not live. I loved last week. I mean, that was so much fun. You guys made it really, seriously, you guys made it super fun. And it was a great way to celebrate my birthday. And, it was so good having those 7 days. That's not something I can do all the time. I would never be able to do that because so most lives that you see on TikTok are unplanned. The creator goes live and they talk to chat, and they, I put work into these. I curate the stories. I write a script for that night to talk about the stories. I come up with the visuals and get those done. I pick out the music that I'm going to play. So it's not just me going live and, winging it. I don't try to wing it. I try to do something like, that's planned, you know. Hardy Boys, I mean, it's possible, you know. I can certainly look up and see, you know, Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew. But yeah, it's just, it opens up a lot of more possibilities doing Mondays. And like with used to be Sunday, you had to wait 2 days to come back and, you know, listen to my stupid voice again. But yeah, I mean, it takes me probably for every 2 hour live, it probably takes me maybe 3 to 4 hours worth of work to put it together. It's not stupid. I know. I was just being a dork. It better not be. I'm trying to do this professionally. I'm glad you guys love it. It was like 14,400 of you apparently that love it. But yeah, it's, and you know what's funny? I was thinking about this yesterday, where like a year ago, I had 2,300 followers, and that blew my mind. I was like, 2,300 people want to look at what I do, and now we're sitting on 14,500, and I'm like, how did this happen? So, but it happened because you guys came in and liked listening to my voice and the stories that I read, and you get something out of it just like I do. And I think that's wonderful. I try to, last week I couldn't. I only did them for the big stories like body politic and, you know, that stuff. But I try to, and it takes a little bit to get them right, because I work through it in Photoshop. So it takes a while. But yeah. So there's more things coming. There are things that I want to do to, you know, I really still would like to have some of my voice actor friends on, like Tessa Vale Audio, to read stuff that they like. So I'm not the one always doing the talking. And trust me, for those of you like, no, we want to hear your voice. Trust me, when you hear Tessa read, you are going to be as enthralled as I am when she reads. Yep. Oh, the voices in Winnie the Pooh. I was like, how am I going to do this? And I didn't, so usually when we got to talk about that. If you have something in mind, Tessa, let me know, and we'll put something together and read something back. We'll dual narrate a story. That would be fun. I would love that. I would absolutely love that. And I still would like to do the Night of the Living Dead. This is one of the things, and I'll let you guys in on something. So the movie Night of the Living Dead, the original, is public domain because George Romero didn't register the copyright correctly. So the script, the movie itself, the music, it's all it's all public domain. So I had this idea to use the script and get together with some of my voice actor friends like Tessa, and do like a full cast audio reading, a live audio, like an old time radio show. And like I get a soundboard and do sound effects, and I can be the narrator and do that. Like that would be so freaking cool. Yeah. Yep. And I would want to do it live because frankly, live opens up so many cool moments, you know? So yeah, that's something that I'm trying to do. Goosebumps is definitely coming. That's going to be one where I might do several in the month of October for around Halloween. And those will be ones that we get to vote on. So be prepared. I would love, now that I've figured out how to do a poll, I would love to do a choose your own adventure night where I prepare all the polls and I write them up and put, and you guys get like a minute to choose. And, you know, I go on to whatever you guys choose. I choose that option. And, you know, I think that would be fun. I used to love those choose your own adventure books. They were so cool. They were so cool. I actually have two, they're like card games for choose your own adventure. But I don't have any friends, so I can't play them. I should say all of my friends are online. I don't have any like real local friends, but you know, so yeah, it's kind of wild. You know, I mean, the way that we connect with people now. You know, I mean, I know I've told you guys about my best friend, and you know, she's 15 years younger than me, lives on the other side of the country, and the chances of us actually meeting, let alone becoming best friends, without this app, this TikTok, is just like almost zero. I'm not one for fate, but holy crap. You know, and I've made wonderful friends on this app. I mean, there's all of you guys. I mean, Tessa has become a great friend. You know, it's so cool. You know, and actually, I mean, I've been able to meet a couple of them face to face over the last couple of years. So it's the friendships that we make online with people, I think, are just as real as the ones we make in person. So, yeah, I mean, like, I've made friends with people who are on the other side of the freaking planet. You know, I mean, there's guys, you know, there's some of you that come in here every live, and you're over in the UK, or, you know, from freaking Norway, or, yeah, that blows my mind. Somebody's in Alaska, and it's just like, I love it. I absolutely love it. I absolutely love it. And like, these lives are like the highlight of my day. And it's on Sunday, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I get to come here and spend 2 hours with you guys, and it's awesome. And yes, Queen of Download, you got in Mexico. It's awesome. It's just awesome. I love it. You know, and if you guys didn't like what I do, I wouldn't be where I'm at right now. You know, on the cusp of 15,000 followers. You know, so, well, I think it's time to call it a night. Thank you all for spending some of your evening with me tonight. Join me on Friday for more weird and astounding tales, and then again on Sunday as we begin the Bridge to Terabithia, which you guys voted on. And if you enjoy these stories and would like to help support what I do here, please consider subscribing or becoming a super fan. It definitely helps keep the campfire lit. And I'll say this again, subscribed or not, I am just happy that you're here. So, until Friday, please be kind to each other. And be kind to yourself. Because kindness matters. And so do you. Good night, everybody.